Hello again and welcome back. This is part 3 of the series on preparing your research paper for journal submission. Let's get started. In the second half of the series, we'll spend some time on the submission process. Let's go over some of the items you'll need to consider prior to submitting your article, and then we'll talk about a cover letter. Early on in your writing timeline, you'll need to narrow down which journal fits your paper. Of course, your research will decide this, but the message and audience of the journal should also be considered. Each peer-reviewed journal has its own impact factor, but that could be less important to you than the fit. Also, you'll need to think about scope and timeline. For example, if there's a call for papers, that's pretty important, or if you need to publish by a certain date because of funding, that's important too. You can do a little scouting to figure out who's on the board behind each journal, and it's okay to reach out to them if you have questions. As the submitting author, you'll need to plan for publication costs. Read this section on page charges carefully before you submit, so that you don't have any surprises when your paper is accepted. Journals have different pricing structures. Some have membership discounts, or they might charge a page fee if your paper is longer than a certain length. Another factor is open access. This is essentially an agreement, a type of copyright, that makes your paper free to read. Some journals are all open access, meaning every paper in them is open access. And some journals are hybrid, where the author can opt in or out. Making your paper open access may cost you more to publish, but doing so will mean your article can be shared widely. Also, you'll need to know if your funding source requires you to publish open access. There are lots of possibilities in how to pay for open access, so check with your target journal on the details. For example, you might qualify for a transformative agreement or a discount, depending on your country, institution, and journal. Another consideration that will surface when you're working with co-authors is the order of names on the paper. This is called the byline, and by default, the first author is listed first. Now you should know that the first author and the submitting author are not necessarily the same person. A unique identifier for authors, called the ORCID ID, is required for the submitting author, but it's a great idea if every author has an ORCID ID. When you go to submit, you'll also be asked about the specific roles of each author. Let's look at that. So it's called Contributor Roles Taxonomy, and it's essentially checking all the applicable boxes of how each author helped, including yourself. There's really not a right or wrong here, but you will want to confer with your co-authors about this before you submit your paper. All right, we've made it to the cover letter. The cover letter is the best way to promote your work, or not. The trick is to craft a short, concise letter that is written to the journal editor or editorial board. Now, as this graphic suggests, you want to conform to the shape and format of what's expected for a cover letter, but you also want to set your paper apart. You will want to tell the journal why your paper is a fit for their audience or their call for papers, if applicable. We'll look at an example next, but be sure to present your message clearly. If you're not fluent in English, ask someone who is to read your cover letter. You will want to be sure that your letter best represents you and your work, so take the time to ask for help in checking grammar and text clarity. Last, here are 2 potential drafts of a cover letter. On the left, the letter does all the main things. It addresses the editor, it identifies the paper title, it tells a little about the paper. It also says the paper is original work and it's not submitted elsewhere, but what it lacks is that memorable connection to the journal. The second letter does all those things, but it also connects the paper to an ongoing conversation in the journal, and it spells out the research impact directly. So of these 2, which letter would capture your interest? Again, take your time so that you create a favorable impression of your paper. Now, part 4 of this series will continue with more information about paper submission, but meanwhile, work on that cover letter.